Today we are talking about quilt pattern ratings. Now, this can be a little bit of a contentious topic. A lot of people don't love the whole adventurous beginner rating that you see on a lot of quilt patterns these days because it's so subjective, right? And so how do you kind of deal with that subjectivity? Is it even useful? Is it not useful to even include on your pattern? Like, what is the point of a rating? Why include one? How should you include one? How do you assign that rating to make it useful to your reader to actually enhance your quilt pattern rather than just being this like extra thing that's on your pattern but doesn't really serve a purpose and just takes up space? That's what we're talking about today. So the way that I like to think about ratings on quilt patterns is very similar to kind of the system that exists already for like movies and TV shows and things like that. And so if you've ever been watching a movie and you see that it's rated like PG-13 or R or mature, like there's all these different ratings, right? You'll see a rating. There's like a letter or number combo that's up there. But then there's also an explanation of what that means, right? They don't just like throw out the rating and leave it at that because there's lots of different reasons why something would be rated PG-13. And the reason for that is because different people like and dislike different things, right? So if something's rated R for language and you don't care about foul language, like who cares? I don't care. It's not going to deter me from watching a movie. But on the other hand, like I don't really like nudity. Just like I'm a private person, it seems really weird, not a huge fan of that, right? So if it's rated R for nudity and violence and stuff like that, I might just stay away from that movie because I just don't really like that stuff. And so having this rating plus the explanation for why it's been given that rating, what things are included in this movie that lead to this rating, that tells the consumer what they're in for and lets them make an informed decision about whether or not they want to consume that content. It's the exact same process for quilt patterns. That's the goal of your rating, is to give your reader more information about what they're getting themselves into so that they don't have any surprises. And so elements of a good rating basically should include a broad difficulty level, right? Beginner, advanced beginner, something like that in terms of quilt patterns. A brief justification for that level. So why have you assigned that level? Is it because you've got template cutting in there that bumps it up to a higher difficulty level? Or is it because there's some curves in there? Why seems like, what is the reason for that rating so that your reader can make an informed decision? Because different quilters find different things difficult, right? I've seen some beginner quilters that have absolutely no problems with curve whatsoever. They love them. And other people that have been quilting, 5-10 years and still stay away from curves because they're scared by them. So making sure that you include the list of techniques that are in your pattern that lead to the rating that you've assigned somewhere on the cover or in the description if you're selling a digital pattern as to why the pattern's been given this rating is really important. There has to be a brief justification for that rating. And then the overall goal here, like I said, is just to make sure that you've left the reader informed about what they're buying, right? You're asking them to give you money for a pattern that they can't look inside and decide for themselves exactly whether or not this is right for them. And so there's got to be a little bit of trust between you and your reader, right? So a good rating will leave your reader informed as to what they're getting themselves into so that there are no surprises, right? We've all had that experience where we've bought a pattern and gone, hang on, like this is way more than I wanted. If I'd have known that this pattern needed all of these things, I wouldn't have bought it. I don't like this kind of pattern. It's now useless to me, but I can't return it because it was a digital pattern. There's no returns on digital patterns, right? Like you don't ever want to leave your reader in that situation. And so a good rating will make sure that all of that stuff's put on the table and that there's absolutely no surprises for your reader. That's the point. So without further ado, here are kind of my basic descriptions of the different levels within quilting. The common levels that you see are beginner, advanced beginner, sometimes called adventurous beginner. Some people have feelings about that. Intermediate, and then advanced. Those are kind of the 4 levels that you'll most commonly see quilt patterns broken into. So a beginner to me, as a tech editor and ghostwriter who's literally written and edited hundreds of patterns, this is what I see as kind of categorizing these different levels. So you can kind of get an idea of the different types of quilters that would be grouped into these different levels. So a beginner, this is probably going to be their first or second quilt, right? They're super green. They need a pattern that assumes very little. So no knowledge assumed besides how to cut with basically a quilting ruler. Like that's the only thing you can assume in a beginner quilt pattern. You can't have any really tiny pieces. Tiny pieces can get really challenging because you have to be accurate. Beginners are usually not accurate. And you usually want to keep those patterns to like 1 or 3 fairly simple blocks in the pattern. Any more than that, and you just have too many pieces to keep track of, which can be really challenging. The most important part of this, though, is that beginners rely on the pattern to pretty much teach them everything they need to know. So if you've got to figure out how to do some like fancy trimming, HST trimming even, right? These things you can't assume a beginner is going to need to know. And so beginner patterns need to have all of that information included in them. Really, really important. Let's talk about what an advanced or adventurous beginner is. So these are people that have made a couple of quilts. They generally have the basics of quilting, right? They also know some basic tips and tricks for maintaining accurate seam allowances, matching up some points, right? Not an expert at any level at this point, right? But they've got some of those basic techniques down. They know how to chain piece, like different things like that, just tips and tricks that you pick up with experience. They've got some of that down already. They're ready for some more advanced shapes, ready for some more advanced point matching, right? You can throw in things like flying geese with different techniques, right? Maybe some really basic curves that are kind of large scale, nothing too tight yet, but ready to kind of just throw in a little bit more advanced things. And you don't have to over-explain everything like you do for a beginner. So you don't have to put, HST trimming diagrams in your pattern. That's probably not necessary anymore. QST trimming diagrams, right? Like some of these basic skills, these quilters have gotten exposure to, and so you don't have to basically assume nothing like you would with a beginner. But these people generally want still pretty simple, quick makes. They don't want anything that's going to take, 2 years of active sewing to make, right? Like you still want to keep the blocks fairly basic, number of pieces fairly low, because as you kind of expand in the number of pieces and cuts that you've got to keep track of, the pattern gets more complex just by the nature of it, right? And so still trying to keep those kind of fairly simple, fairly large pieces. That's kind of the adventurous, advanced beginner stage. Intermediate is someone who's really started to get a good basic knowledge of quilting. So they know what a scant quarter inch is. They know how to maintain a scant quarter inch. They've picked up kind of these tips and tricks to get points matching fairly well, right? They know how to trim and square up their blocks. You don't need to show them every step of the way, right? You can just say square up your block to 12.5 inches square, and they're going to know to make sure that their block's centered. They're going to know instinctively that they've got to keep that extra quarter inch off the point of their flying geese. You can't just cut it flush like a beginner might tend to, things like that. They're still learning some of these new techniques, but they're ready for projects that are a little bit more intricate. So that have, lots of steps, lots of pieces. They're able to keep track of those pieces without getting overwhelmed, that kind of thing. That's kind of the intermediate stage. Advanced, to me at least, is pretty much anything beyond that. So they know lots of quilting techniques. They've been quilting for probably several years at this point. They know how to work with fabric, starching, keeping everything nice and square, straight of grain, bias grain. They know those terms. They understand what it means for them and how to deal with it. They've mastered all those basic techniques. They know how to work with complex designs, lots of intricate steps. But the most important feature of an advanced quilter, to me, the thing that separates an intermediate from an advanced quilter, is that they have all of the skills they need to be successful with advanced techniques right after learning them. Right. So this is someone that can pick up a quilt pattern and there's a technique they've never seen before, but they can kind of follow the instructions and pretty quickly be able to master it because they've got all of those foundational quilting skills. That's an advanced quilter. And so, as long as you provide kind of the basics, the critical instruction for them, they're off to the races. So I've talked a lot about kind of the different types of quilters and difficulty levels out there, but in terms of actually categorizing a pattern, that may or may not be that helpful to you because you're like, well, I don't know if a basic quilter would be able to make this or not. Like, I just don't have that context. So what I have here is just kind of a list of really common techniques that you'll find in quilt patterns and how I think about them in terms of a difficulty level. There is a much, much more extensive list and their difficulty levels categorized on a blog post on my website that I will link in the description that you can check out if you're interested in. But basically, beginner quilting skills are, straight of grain piecing. Obviously, that's like the most basic quilting skill. Strip piecing, I would include in that stitch and flip. So anytime you're kind of drawing diagonal and then just aligning it to the corner of a piece, stitching on that line and then flipping it over in order to get your basic piece shape, that's a very basic skill. Intersections with, I would say, like 6 or less fabrics. reasonable for most beginner quilters. Anytime you get kind of over that 6 fabric threshold, so we're talking like 2 HSTs and 2 squares coming together, the bulk there and the alignment that needs to happen can get really, really tricky. So that's something to think about as well. It's not just the shapes that you're including that might bump you up to the next difficulty level. 2 at a time HSTs, very basic technique for beginners. That's probably the easiest way to make HSTs in my opinion, but you're gonna need to include some trimming diagrams as well. And in general, any of these techniques can kind of be downgraded to the previous skill level if you over-explain and make sure that there is extra information in your pattern explaining how to do these techniques. That'll take you back to the previous level if you add enough information to your quilt pattern. If you take away that information, it might bump it up to the next one. It's not really, hard and fast categories here. We're talking about a spectrum of techniques. Advanced or adventurous beginners, techniques I associate with those kinds of skill levels are inset strips. So anywhere where you're like cutting a piece in half and then sewing those 2 halves to another piece of fabric, that's an inset strip. That's kind of a more advanced skill because it's not as common. 8 at a time HSTs, a little bit more trickier to do than 2 at a time HSTs, but still not difficult. No waist flying geese. So that's the one where you start with the big square and the 4 little squares and you kind of do all of these like awkward cutting operations in order to get it. It's not a difficult technique, but there's a lot of steps going on there. That's why that kind of bumps you to your advanced or adventurous beginner skill set. Simple FPP I would include with this. So if you've got like a heart-shaped FPP that's got like 5 pieces, very, very easy. That's advanced, adventurous, beginner. Anything kind of more complicated than that's going to bump you up to a much more difficult level. On-point layouts I would also include as like an advanced, adventurous, beginner because those can get a little bit trickier. That's not something you would just want to throw at a beginner quilter without kind of over-explaining and making sure that you've got all your assembly diagrams really laid out there because there are some nuances to on-point layouts that are just not obvious to most quilters. Intermediate, we're talking about, more intersections, more points to align. So intersections with 7 or 8 fabrics, 4 HSTs coming together. That can be tricky to manage bulk and alignment. So that's why it's an intermediate level. Bias piecing. So anytime you've got kind of big blocks that have a ton of bias around their edges where it's going to really want to stretch and warp on you, that's a more intermediate technique unless you've kind of added all of these helpful tips and tricks in your pattern to make it more accessible for a more beginner quilter. HRTs are definitely intermediate. A lot of people struggle with those. You've got to have like really good trimming diagrams for those in order to make them accessible. Any kind of 60-degree piecing. So we're talking about, equilateral triangles, 60-degree diamonds, hexagons, anything like that. Definitely an intermediate skill just because there's a lot of differences in the way that you have to align those pieces. Tiny piecing. So a lot of people don't realize this. If you're doing strip piecing where you've got like 1/2 inch or 1 inch strips, that is definitely an intermediate skill because there is just such a higher level of precision required in order to get everything to work out. So anytime you're dealing with pieces, even if they're just regular squares and rectangles that are less than about 1 inch finished dimension, that's going to bump you up a skill level. Advanced techniques are the things that people are afraid of, right? That not a lot of people have familiarity or experience with. So partial seams, this is not a Y seam, guys. This is where you start one part of the seam and then work your way around and finish it at the end. It's not tricky. It's just not something that's common. And so you've really got to draw your diagrams well in order to explain what's going on here. Intersections where you've got 10 plus fabrics, right? So these are things where you've got like 4 60-degree diamonds coming together that are all compound. And it's so much bulk and so much alignment that you've got to deal with that this really has to be an advanced technique. Complex FPPs, so if you're making like a dog face and there's like 5 bajillion pieces and they're all weird angles and like just a lot going on there, that is definitely advanced. Any kind of non-standard curves, so there's been a lot of patterns recently, which I love, that are like curves where you make your initial quarter circle curve block and then you cut it in a bunch of different directions and then piece them back together. There's tricky alignment that goes there. So anytime you're not dealing with like a regular circle piece, you've got like an oblong curve or something like that. These are definitely more advanced techniques, again, because those same assumptions that most quilters have about where the alignment points are, how to align them, don't necessarily apply here anymore. And so you've got to include that in your pattern, but it's also, people aren't going to have familiarity with these techniques already. And so anytime that's the case, we're thinking it's probably going to be more like an advanced skill set. And then the dreaded Y seam, of course, that is an advanced skill. Most people are afraid of these things, don't want to deal with it. They're not really that hard, but I know how to sew them and I still struggle to get everything to align properly. It's still a trickier skill set, even if you know what you're doing. So this is definitely an advanced skill. So I hope that gives you an idea of how to go about assigning your quilt pattern rating. Also, that you should be including a quilt pattern rating and what the purpose of it is. A lot of people see ratings as kind of like gatekeeping. Well, you're not advanced enough to handle this pattern. How dare you? It's not that at all, right? The goal of this, at least the way that I think about it, is to give your reader as much information as possible so that they end up with a pattern that they're happy they bought and with a quilt that they love, which is the whole point, right? Happy customer, happy business. That's the goal in quilt pattern designing. It is about your customer and not about you. That's all I've got for today. If you like this episode, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will see you next time for Tech Tip Tuesday. See ya.